easiest way to get into the
Wholeness, welcome. This is Josh Dippold of integratingpresence.com, and we've got a part two to our conversation, so to speak, and with Randi Green here and Alex Manning. And of course, I said I'm Josh Dippold. I'm still Josh Dippold as far as I know. That's what they call me. We're going to call this one on tools and teachers, although we kind of were joking right before we recorded that the standard cliche, don't do this at home, right? So, but this is, and then why we don't do this at home. We'll probably gloss over some of these traditional, I don't know if they're awakening tools. It's just things, if you go into a crystal shop or a spiritual store or things like that, just kind of all the different paraphernalia and things you can buy that are physical, but also their own little systems. So I had a little list before we started about things. Well, not necessarily all of them. Psychedelics and different substances. Healing modalities. There are a ton of healing modalities out there and ways and systems of healing. Then there's spiritual systems in general. You know, we have things like from anywhere from different religious systems to new age and spiritual systems, esoteric, occult systems, all these different types of things. There's things like astrology. There's all kinds of different versions of astrology, Vedic astrology, Western astrology, Hellenistic astrology, I think, which I know very little about. There's the tarot and all these different card decks, right? Crystals too. I think we're all a fan of crystals, but the way we talk about using them is far different than what's usually thought of. But the big thing I think that we could talk about in more detail, other than glossing over these other ones, is teachers and friends, you know. However we want to approach that, like what to look for in teachers and what to look for in friends, you know. And if we do use tools at some point along the way, you know, how do we vet these tools? I know I'll just give well, actually, no, I'm going to pass this over to you guys now to say anything.
Yeah, I think I would just add, I think we can think of these as kind of gateway tools, right? So when you're starting off in your process or your path, you start to dabble perhaps in some of these tools or practices you're looking for answers, right? You're seeking answers, you're learning about yourself, you're learning about your intuition. Trial and error, and you're kind of finding your rhythm with, trusting your intuition and, but, you know, what you alluded to and why we were talking about don't try this at home, in a sense, you're still displacing your power, so to speak. You're still externally looking for answers or guidance from an outside system, an outside framework, or an outside toolkit, right? But I think on your point about teachers and friends, you know, maybe we can talk about how that's a different kind of toolkit than some of these more esoteric.
Sure. And I'll just play devil's advocate here for a second and say, well, don't you think there's some kind of good reason these things are around? You know, all these people still use them and they get these so-called results from them, right? If they're completely pointless and useless, why are people still into them? And if I were to answer my own question, I would say, well, people are reliant on crutches. They're habitual, maybe in their nature. They're addicted, kind of. Maybe they're scared to venture out on their own. I know the few times I've went to readers, I usually look at people that don't have props. I call these things props sometimes, you know. And it's not just because I'm ignorant of them. I have some knowledge in some ways, but then I think maybe the one way to look at it too, though, is what is my take on this? How do I do this? Can I pick up a tarot deck or a crystal and not have to read about it or go to any kind of outside source? And so how do I intuitively start working with this? What's my take on this? Because so many people will ask me, I have a little crystal collection, you know, what does this one do? What's it about? And I say, well, I'm interested in that information sometimes too, but I like to just pick it up and see what I get and work with it, and then later go on and see maybe for confirmation or to see how other people are working with it, so it doesn't influence how I do it. Because a lot of people, once they're told something, they think, oh, well, that's just how it is, and then they disregard their own processes and their own take and their own way of doing with it, and then we just have a more gray hive mind type things, and people just follow into the things that have already set, and we've got this hierarchical system of, oh, I'm the knowledge expert, this is how it is. And so people just think less of themselves. They think, well, I don't have that kind of knowledge, or if I said something it would be really stupid, so I'll just go along with what's already out there.
I think it's good to ask, oneself when you're doing this, what is the intention, right? So usually with astrology, you're trying to understand your own personality structure a little bit better. Or tarot, you're, maybe not trying to predict the future, but in some capacity, you're looking for some confirmation or affirmation of something, right? So I think that's also an important piece of this, is looking at your intentions.
Yes.
Why are you engaging in this process? What is the outcome you're looking for? And what is it affirming or not affirming for you?
And I would say the big delineations here are this classic service to self or service to others too. I think that's a huge thing. And I see so many kind of more, I guess, maybe left-handed or service to self type things in these communities, which, I don't want to completely write off, because there's some people that do need to focus on themselves and work on themselves instead of other people sometimes. But it obviously can get turned into, oh yeah, what can I get? Can I get money, power, relationships type of things, instead of saying, okay, well, yes, I need a certain degree of well-being and self-care, but after that, am I just going to focus all my time and energy on myself? I mean, that's fairly selfish. And then why am I doing that? Why would I do that? Why can't I, or, and then looking at the service to others, the more, well, we can also argue though too, the more I take care of myself, since we're all interconnected, everyone else benefits. But one of the guidance I've have is around, well, if I want something, then I should also want it for everybody else, right? So what would the world look like if everybody had the same things that I'm after, doing the same things that I do too?
Yeah. And I think the next kind of question or set of questions is, what am I linking up to when I'm participating? And what kind of energies and people, collective energies or individuals, what am I linking up to when I participate in these rituals, practices?
And some people might throw it back there with the tarot. I actually like it, looking at it as the archetypal nature of humanity, right? So that's one way that most people don't usually work with it, but I think I find it really helpful to see all these different archetypes. I actually have challenge with the minor arcana, because that seems a little bit more mysterious to me sometimes than even the major arcana, because the major arcana seem to have so much power in them, and so much stand out so much,
that's
right?
The minor arcana is that's the personality traits. It's all about the lower fields.
Exactly. I never understood that. It's why even bother with that stuff?
You got the coins,
that
are the materialistic level. You have got the staff that are the fire, that's mental compared to what many people think. And then you actually have the cups that are the emotional level. And then you have the swords, but that's discernment. And that is a higher level of fire, or a higher level of what we call, many people see the staffs as the spirituality of the fire element as the spiritual realm. But actually discernment, I want to go where I go here, is that this is not something I studied, because the first time I got a tarot, I call it tarot with the T at the end, in my hands, I knew per intuition what to do with it. So I've discovered that with many of these tools that I kind of go into, this body that I'm currently part of has its own history of having dabbled with these different tools earlier on, from earlier times, including the Buddhist monk, and already when I had, as I said, this understanding of how to meditate before I was even at age. Nobody taught me anything. The same with the tarot card. Once I got the deck in my hand, it was just like it flowed from me. I just knew exactly what it was all about. And for me, tarot is nothing to do with divination, or if you go to the Egyptian version of it, yes, that's Brotherhood teachings. That's used for something within Freemason, and the symbols are connected to a specific type of number system, a specific type of pyramidal system that goes with these different levels of stages of aspiration. And then you can say, well, that's kind of the four lower levels of it, that where you work with it on that level. But where you have the major arcana, that's the collective, the archetypes. but they are also sometimes associated with the Kabbalah. So you need to know which one you're actually dealing with, and what is it that you're working with when you're working with these dynamics.
Yeah, and the deck itself and the intent behind the deck itself. I mean, you can get like a Crowley deck or a Thothian deck. You can with the standard. The only thing the way I worked with it, I got a standard. Well, then there's this maybe superstition around you're not supposed to buy your first deck. You're supposed to be given it. So I went out and bought one and gave it, 2 of them actually, before I got my first one given to me. Then I made sure I went out and gave another one. So but anyway, that's kind of more superstitious. But I took it 1 card at a time. I put it on my refrigerator on a magnet. And just every time I went by the refrigerator, I would stare deeply at it and what kind of information I would get from it. The kind of the meaning and the larger nature of the symbols and the kind of the energetics, I guess, and the consciousness level of it. And just that's how I took it, and went through the whole deck, 1 card each few days.
This is where you need to know what you're working with.
And I didn't read anything else whatsoever.
No, but the pictures themselves are like we could call pictograms. They are kind of what we could say subconscious material. That's psychological.
Sure.
The symbols, they take you into what we could call the deeper levels of your psyche that creates bridges, that opens up different gate systems, all depending on what deck you're working with. So of course, if you're working with the really shitty decks like Crowley, then you get into some really shit show there, and the Thothian decks and all of these are dark decks. Right? These are serious dark decks. So of course, unless you are an old Atlantean and you use the shitty magic in the old days, you're not doing these decks at all. You find something else. For me, the recommendation, which I used to do in the early times when I had my own school and here in Denmark, I recommended the decks that were only focusing on the subconscious, drawing up subconscious material, not these heavy ritualistic, magically infused decks, because that's for the old Atlanteans.
That's what the Rider-Waite is, kind of the standard that they compare everything else to. That's the one I did, and it was heavily subconscious, unconscious material is what I got. Now the numbers in there, I was never a number person, and just because I always see numbers as, well, you can assign anything a number. Like you get a football player, right, and you put his name and a number on there. I mean, does it really mean anything? But then I say, well, what are people reading meaning into numbers? And I could see that, but I can also see how certain numbers seem to appear or be correlated with certain types of patterns and events and things like this. So very mysterious to me, just like astrology as well.
The original Egyptian decks did not have numbers.
So
you see, that's a later adding. We are talking Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, things were added in.
Like 4 of Swords, they didn't have any of the numbers on there. No. How were the?
It was kind of the picture itself.
I see.
So
they didn't need to have a certain number of swords on each individual one.
In ancient Egypt, they didn't have 4 of Swords.
They had swords and they had image. They didn't. So what did they have?
I don't know. It would have been something completely different. So what we need to discern here is about when we talk about the original tools that goes behind the history of these decks and what they've been used for back then in the temples and what they've been used for now. Because what we have now is a production of the Middle Ages, where everything got conflated. We had the whole Christianity, symbols, alchemy, archangels, the lot. So most of the cards we have today, they are a mess. So they are not really of any use. They're not. In my perception, they're not usable for anything other than subconscious material, as well as the collective subconscious that goes with myths, that goes with distortion, that goes with the astral plane. So for me, it's a tool to breach the astral plane, to create a gateway, as you said, Alex, into the astral plane.
And go beyond that, right?
Yes, but then you leave behind the tarot cards because they are only for use on the astral plane.
I see.
They cannot be used for high awakening processes.
And this is where a lot of people get trapped, thinking they've woken up, but they've only just reached the astral plane, right?
Yes, lower levels of it.
Lower levels. And so now we see this in cycles of consciousness, right? Like in Egypt, supposedly, there was really high levels, and then it got into the pharaohs, right? And then it just all devolved from there. Or we get like, what are some of the things, like these things in nature, they've got deified, right? these processes that happen in nature, well, then all of a sudden, I guess the level of consciousness drops somehow. And then these natural processes that more people had a higher level of awareness and consciousness could see things as processes, but then at a certain point they couldn't. So they kind of deified these different processes is what I've heard some people say. And I can kind of see how that happens. So it doesn't make, it's not too far a stretch to say that was with the tarot deck too, compared to earlier systems that they might have drawn on, because I think the history around it too is not entirely clear or something like that. And even the one card, and we'll go into one detail here for some flavor maybe, but the Hanged Man. So it's supposedly, from what I've heard, that doesn't really have any origins, or the origin of that card is not like scholarly, the origins of it is not scholarly noted, if I'm getting that right. So what does that draw on? What's your, if I could ask, what is your take on that card?
Well, not that specific card, but what I would go into is this whole kind of, you try to trace to the origin and the root of it, and then we go further down and say, okay, where does it come from? Did the ancient cultures have this? And we're talking the really ancient cultures. For me, we have the demarcation line 15,000 years ago, where we had this new type of humans that were seeded into this reality. And then when we talk about these tools, they are quite late. So that's where we have the scavenger races and the prohibited technologies that came in. So we might have had an original temple cult that were kind of focused on props, focusing on rituals, focused on different ways of working with the alternate reality. But when we talk about the ancient realities and the ancient temple cults, for me, the priests that were there, they didn't need these tools because they were linked up to alien technology. So they were all infused with alien technology, enhanced by alien genetics, and by that had the direct line to the aliens that were coming in as colonization of a reality field. So for me, tarot and all of these
divination.
Thank you. And whatever props you can come up with are for lay people.
Well, that's right. And so it's also been kind of turned into the materialization of some of the spirituality, right?
Yes, it's a trap. It's a booby trap.
So you're taking spiritual processes, which means not material, right? And making them material in one way. This also goes with the technologicalization of consciousness and energy too. Instead of relying on our natural, our consciousness and energy,
it's a way to give you away. The more you work with the tool, the more you imbue your energy into it, and the more you become depending on that tool. For instance, this kind of whatever scrying crystal or what have you. I tried that for a little while, but my energy was so strong I could make it go wherever I wanted to go. It was not scrying for me. I made it scry. So I might as well just look at the map and say, what does my intuition tell me, right? So for me, and that's why I'm very, very cynical when we talk about all the things that people are using. For me, that's the old version of a rabbit hole.
Let me ask this. What if you made your own tarot cards? Are you still linking up to that?
Well, then you're just putting your own energy into some kind of visuals. So why even make the tarot card? Why not just work with it in contemplation and meditation? Work directly with the image and then go from there and see where it takes you. Explore the image.
It's a good point. It makes me think of art now too, because a lot of people think of, they call these the esoteric arts, right? Or the occult arts and things like this. But there's a lot to say, I think, and maybe I don't want to take this in this too much of a direction, but the art in general, just standard everyday art, painting, sculpture, movies, which is one of the, I would think, even higher art forms, because it can encapsulate all these other ones if done well. But and then even in a way, this, whatever this is called Josh, it's kind of like an art project as well.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if there's and we can turn our lives into that too, or it doesn't necessarily have to be a formal art thing, right, as well. But then we can mix science into it too. I don't know where I'm going with this, but
an evolving creationary process. Yeah,
and definitely if people feel like drawing stuff, then we know there are drawing therapy, and as a psychotherapist, right, you can take your entire subconscious, just go into this theta state and then just draw a picture or draw something on a piece of paper and whatever, and then afterwards look at it, meditate upon it, and do some kind of what does this show me? What is it that I have surfaced here? How am I to work with this? And I will also recommend, after that process is done, then burn the paper and toss it out, because then the process is over. Don't keep it. Don't say, oh, this is so whatever. But because whatever we work with, whenever we put something into manifestation, the more aware we get, the more we understand how to work with energy. And we also understand that this kind of putting everything into a materialistic exemplification of our energy system kind of ties us to a specific nodal point in time. It also ties us to a specific version of who we are. And if we work with awakening as a process to what we call more and more expanded awareness, then we tie ourselves to anchor points that are narrowing us down by using these tools.
Yeah.
This brings up too that the thing with the ink blots, right? To interpret that as conscious unconscious material, but also like this automatic drawing, automatic writing, and see kind of like tune out and just see what comes on the page and then interpret it later. These are all different types of practices too. But the burning thing also reminded me of the oral traditions, right? A lot of these esoteric teaching systems and traditions, it was only spoken. So it had to be passed down from a living teacher, their lineage. It couldn't be written down, but a lot of these things later got written down, and so it's not the quite same thing. And there's rules too around writing down as the higher levels go on, right? There's only so many things that can be said explicitly in books, right? Or there'll be either repercussions, or maybe it might not even be, the capacity might not be there to begin with to be able to do that. I don't know exactly how all that works, but
it just works with the mere fact that the higher you get up in awareness, the higher you work, where we can define what awareness is, but the higher perception level of reality you're able to contain and hold, the more complex it gets. And thereby you understand, well, the complexity of the information I'm working with here is so advanced that I can only take a portion and draw that as a dot or something. But then the rest is inside our energy system, is inside our capacity of perception wherever we point that. But we also learn we can only use snippets of it at a time.
And this reminds me now again of the historical Buddha, who basically taught from almost his entire waking hour, from when his point of enlightenment till when he died, and people just supposedly listened to his teachings and then memorized them, right? But so that's right, because he taught for certain levels, but there's only, and then to a discourse to whoever was present. So it would be relevant to whoever was there, whoever was listening, their capacity, and at the same time, you can only do so much in certain ways. So like the discernment of what's the most relevant, what's going to seep in and be the most beneficial in this little moment in time. Yeah. So and then Randi mentioned defining awareness. So one of the other things we talked about before we started this topic is just defining these very kind of, I don't know, high-minded, high-ideal terms, but they're all similar, but they're distinctly different. So maybe I'll just read them here, and if we decide we want to give a definition to these, I find it helpful just to put a ground rule for other things, or lay a groundwork for other things. And then also maybe we'll talk about teachers and friends, because that's the kind of thing that we can benefit, because we're going to have teachers and friends no matter if we're on an awakening or path or not, I would think. So, but these terms, awareness, mind and heart-mind, consciousness, mindfulness, attention, and perception. So were they all kind of similar? They're distinctly different. Let's start the big one here, what we were going to define in the last show, awareness. For my take, the only thing that's coming to me that I think I could maybe give of note here that I've heard recently is awareness is more like a receptive thing. It's not something so much I do, but it's something that I just kind of allow and open up to, and then it happens. There's an awareness kind of maybe a knowing. I don't know, how would you guys define awareness?
So I think mine is actually a little bit more aggressive in the sense that mine feels more, or my definition feels more seeking. So a little bit more momentum, but just a little bit different than your take on it.
Make a definition of something that I have no words for. That's
these are lofty and loaded terms.
Because in a way I could have said, I kind of call it expanded perception. So for me, awareness is very, very tied into perception. Yeah. But perception is also tied to the level of capacity we have of perceiving complex information. So for me, that goes with how we have worked with our emotional field, mental field, and biofields, the three lower fields that constitutes our physical form. So if we are tied into the emotional awareness, then we will perceive from an emotional level, and our response system to whatever comes our way will be based upon emotional response mechanisms. That goes with the limbic system, to be very kind of nitty-gritty here. And that's electrochemically driven. And that will be interpreted according to our personal narrative of reality, our comfort zone, the psychological dynamics, and what we kind of feel we are able to cope with. But if we have mental awareness, then we kind of say that sciences, or that can be abstract teaching systems, or the awareness of energy in itself, the awareness of atoms on their own level, the awareness of how to interact in that way with that type of energy. So for me, awareness is tied into perception as well as how I can interact with these different levels of reality. And that's why awareness for me cannot be defined, because it's a tool like everything else. And then we can say, is awareness the same as consciousness? And I would say absolutely not, because awareness is an ability to actually define things, because you're perceiving things on their own energetic level. Where whether it's emotional or it's mental or it's higher energy system wise, because their awareness expands into a whole holographic type of technology setting, which is controlled by consciousness units, which is something entirely else. So for me, consciousness, when people talk about consciousness as being similar to awareness or similar to mind, I would say no, mind is what we have in the mental processes of the brain. Awareness is our perception and interpretation and interaction with reality. And consciousness then goes with our higher order abilities that very few people have activated yet.
The way I look at consciousness is that it's tied to capacities, right? But awareness has really no limit. I mean, it can be, I think I look at it as more boundless and limitless. Now our access to it might be limited. And I usually look more at consciousness, right? But I don't know. So what was the other term? So that was brilliantly put with the mind is more, obviously, it makes sense, right? Mind has to do more with the brain and things like this, and mental processes,
But I think it's important when we talk about the esoteric teaching systems, including the Buddhist teaching systems, is that you kind of have mind as the normal low-level mind of the human, of an animal, what have you, the brain processes, right? But then you have the higher states of more subtle type of energies that produce a subtle type of mind, and I can't remember how they are put together, but I think it's something about the chitta and the manas, and these expressions.
Well, yeah, they're different. I know in the Theravada system, not the Abhidhamma system, but the consciousness, they talk about 6 types of consciousness, and it's just the 5 senses plus mind. So to make it start with like smell, okay? Because there's a physical organ, the nose, that can, receive smells, then there has to be the actual scent of a smell. And then when that meets the organ, the contact, when that contact happens, with olfactory consciousness arises. And
I will call that awareness.
Yeah.
Because the difference here is, because I don't call it a consciousness. For me, it's we're going to nitty-gritty details.
We need these.
We're having this automated kind of, everybody's breathing. Nobody's really thinking about they are breathing. So
unless
part
you're
of
meditating.
Yes,
and
the
then
meditation.
You're not thinking. You're aware that you're
yes, exactly. You become aware that you are
observing.
You're observing, aware
Noticing.
that you're actually breathing. You're working with breathing as a meditation object, and then you go in really investigating the breathing and where it does, and actually it goes to some of the frontal lobes, the lowest levels of the frontal lobe, which is interesting in itself. And when we talk about the esoteric teaching systems, we go in actually the olfactory, the inner smell is one of the last senses, the inner senses that get activated, because it goes with discernment, what smells good, what smells bad. So the meditation is the awareness, suddenly become aware of breathing. So for me, we could say, well, is that the awareness of it, perception of it, does that then lead to smell consciousness? consciousness, and I'm not sure about that.
It's really, go ahead.
I was going to say you're pulling in information when you breathe, right? And I'm a little bit biased here because I do have a little bit of a psychic sense of smell, and the physical processes for smelling in the physical, it's a little bit different than breathing in something and getting information from your olfactory system, and then that producing a particular kind of smell. So I think there's a nuance there.
Oh yeah. So now I'm talking about on the basic level. Okay.
Oh, okay.
So basically meaning there's a scent.
Yeah.
And there's a nose, and then there's smelling happening. Okay, not describing what scent it is, or if it's a rich, savory sense, but just smell.
Process.
So we look at a vision right now. There's a distinction between seeing and looking. Looking is more of an active process. Seeing is just there's visual content happening. But how many times a day are we seeing, but not knowing that we're really seeing? So it's almost like bringing awareness to the fact that vision is happening, right? There's sight present now because we're talking about external, but it also applies internally too. Yeah. There's a physical eye and then there's sense object. And when the physical eye meets the sense object, that contact gives rise to sight, but it's not describing the forms and the colors and the light so much as just that bare, basically it's knowing in what's being known. So it's just sight, so then everything else on that can possibly be a perception added on top of that. So what am I seeing? How am I seeing it? What does it look like? All these things. So I think that's how they view, or how it's viewed in the Theravada system. Unless I'm probably distorting this too. But the mind thing, that's where a lot of it comes in, because there's a mind, which some people would say, well, wait a second, the mind isn't a physical organ. I'm like, yeah, I don't know how that works either, because I can't see, touch, taste the mind the way other things can be, right? But there's seemingly this thing called mind, and then there's a mind object, what the mind is being aware of, and when those two meet, then mind consciousness arises. So they in that system they consider a mind the sixth sense or whatnot. And well, then the Mahayana goes into, well, there's two other types of consciousness. One of the I forget what the seventh one, but the next one is this alaya, or the storehouse consciousness that stores this information or something, where there's that goes into rebirth, and I don't know enough about that to really talk about that. So
I would say more kind of if we're using our own devices to interpret whatever's going on. For instance, for me, one of the reasons why I'm not going completely berserk in the Buddhist ideas is because that's just the teaching system.
Exactly.
And people get lost in the teaching systems.
Yes,
when we talk about teachers and teaching systems, people get lost, and then they recite all that they have learned and just become little parrots, and we say, this is that type of consciousness, this is this, and whatever.
Very good point,
and they forget completely to investigate on their own. So
Exactly.
I'd rather go in as I did when I began meditating. Again, this kind of knowing already what I needed to do. Again, fortunately for me, some have it, some haven't got it. But going in and quickly going to that understanding of, why am I meditating, for instance, as a tool for awareness? And for me, it's about learning to become the observer of what I am involved in. And that goes first and foremost the tangible level with the cup, learning to see the cup as the cup. That was one of the first exercises I did, because I was always, this is a cup, and then I just perceived it as a cup, and I stopped thinking more about it because someone taught me it was a cup. Yeah. But then I stopped thinking about it as what people had taught me it to be, and looked at it, and then something interesting actually happened. Because I focused my mind on it, and not my eyes on it, but my mind on it, and tried to merge my mind with the cup stopped having the form, and it became matter. It became energy. It became this. When I can do that now, I kind of feel the ceramics. I feel the molecules of the ceramic. It's been burned. I got the whole history of the cup. It suddenly unraveled this whole kinetic processes information system. This kind of, and if I do it with a table or something or a tree, I get completely submerged into. I can't breathe, because then my mind begins to perceive the energy itself and interpret the energy itself. Similar with smell. Smell is not just about me smelling something. It's actually about energy that my tool, which is a nose, to work with waves of smell and particles of smell used to combine into my brain. But if I use my mind instead, then I can actually smell some of the alien visitors I have. Some of them, they smell disgusting. Even though there's nothing in the room, you have a smell that's so yuck, because that's the mind that's smelling. So that's the extrasensory system that kicks in.
You nailed it.
Yeah, there's the internal, because the internal sight, right? What people are seeing internally in hallucinations or vision quests, things like this, or meditation, or however their abilities, there's still the internal sight. So that's the internal part of this, and it would make sense to the smell too. But this is the most important point here for me so far, is that yes, this has to be seen and known for oneself. Teaching systems are okay, but that's sometimes I do veer into that too much, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what anybody says. And that's what I like about the historical Buddha too, is he said, you have to see and know this for yourself. You can't take my word for it. You have to check it out for yourself. And so that's what it really comes down to for me, all of this. Yep. And we mentioned that in the last show as well. Yep.
Yeah. Alex, you want to throw in something?
No, I think you nailed it. I think you guys nailed it. It's really about how you're perceiving information, how you're processing that information, asking why do I see the cup immediately? Why am I not just trying to process the information correctly versus the bias? So nothing.
And I think, thank you for saying that, because that actually leads me kind of say, well, that's the part of the awakening awareness process.
Yeah. Yes.
Because there you learn to really understand what you actually are perceiving and what type of energy are you working with, instead of trying to conceptualize it within the known concept of what we've been indoctrinated with and what teachers tells us it is, but actually go in and say, okay, I'm experiencing this, and then it comes all down to, okay, do I need to label it? Do I actually need to put words to it? Do I need to have an explanation for it?
Exactly.
Or could I just perceive it and just be in it and just say, this is what it is.
Yeah.
Do I even need to know how to do it? So this comes now to not a polarity, or maybe it is. So on one hand, we have the folks that are too scared to kind of do things on their own, right, without guidance. And that they think they have to have a teacher with everything. But then you have other people that are just maybe way far out in left field, where it would almost benefit for them to have some kind of connection to reality, and saying, maybe I do need to bounce this off some friends or some teachers. So I guess maybe we would look at this dynamic of, what to look for in teachers and friends. If we're on one end of the spectrum or the other, how to get away from teachers and friends sometimes, because some people are so tied into their friends, they don't really have the opportunity to break away sometimes, to do kind of deep solo practice, or, solo retreats, so where they can clear out all these external influences from teachers and friends, while other people, they may be their little lone wolf, or a little bit more too much hermit energy, where they would actually benefit from some spiritual friends, and at least checking in for some other teachers from time to time. So
I think you need to start with frameworks and terminology, and then as you evolve, you're keeping some things, you're throwing out other things. And one thing, Randi, I love about your teachings is that you're constantly evolving your terminology, and essentially even invented and created your own set of terminology, your own language, your own frameworks. And so you have to start somewhere, but it's always evolving, and you're keeping some things, you're throwing out other things constantly, and it's a process.
Yeah. Just to catch up on, or pick up on the I'm not inventing out of the blue.
Right,
yes.
right, yes.
And plus also the old languages that goes with Greek and ancient Egypt and all of these ancient languages, they had different word constructions where they could combine different things and then make up a new word, but it was within a system. Sure. So it's not just me coming up with blah, 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 or goro.
Right.
Actually, that takes some real, the etymology of words, like where did they come from? There was this book I read years ago called like The Professor and the Madman. It was like this really high-level professor, but he was working with this guy who was institutionalized, and they were doing a dictionary. They were going through and writing dictionary definitions. It was this pair that was that was mainly responsible for this. And could you imagine? How much of us that aren't in language arts really know the etymology, where these words came from?
Sure.
And then it's a huge, long process. And then Yeah, it's what we do have some new words, right, that are added all the time, but they seem so debased these days. I'm trying to think of some silly examples, but
But it's good to get back to when we talk about people that are completely unstructured and
Yes.
people that are almost worshippers, right?
Sure.
Because what I discover in my own journey, and it always begins with how we perceive things ourselves. And sometimes it can be made into a generic understanding, but most of the time everything is within the individual. But what I kind of explored and experienced was that I had all of these things coming in, all of these experiences, and one of the things I discovered very early on was that I needed structure. I needed some kind of, whether it was my own system or some other system, I needed a discipline, I needed a structure, I needed some kind of, not ritual, because then it becomes ritualistic and rigid, but kind of an everyday where I did some kind of practice that kept me in a framework. So I would have this as a grounding, used it as a grounding. For me, it was exercise, actually, because I spaced so much out. I had this full activation of my peripheral nervous system in the 2000s. And the way I worked around that was walking a lot in nature. It was also doing exercise. So I grounded myself by doing that and not doing all of these, again, sorry guys out there, the ridiculous grounding exercises. Oh, you need to do this, then you ground. No, whenever I began working with energy, I completely feel like a rocket. So I needed to go out and feel my body, exercise, eating healthy, going to the loo when I had to go to the loo, sleep when I needed to sleep, get the whole basic level in place first. So that was my first natural instinct with this whole, I was awakening, so I needed to create a counter for that. And that was exercise, that was right food, that was right sleep, that was right amount of water, learning to nurture myself, take care of my body. So that was the first, when we talk about people that are sitting in meditation, spacing out, or the old gurus, or you have these Buddhist monks that are nothing but flesh and bone because they're not eating anything because they're so high leveled up. I'm saying, yeah, that's all good and fine. You're depriving the body. Okay, that's what you choose to do. But for me, this is about when I'm inside this reality, I need my physical form. So thereby I need to take care of it. For me, that's the first step in the awakening process. Learn to take care of your own body the right way so you have the energetic foundation for the higher levels of awareness.
And also some people go the other end where they just turn their nutrition, I know I can be a little bit of a health nut sometimes, turn that into the whole spiritual path, right? And they don't really do anything other than that and get too far into comfort zones and things like this. And so they don't take the risk that's needed. And we've talked a little bit about how crises can help. But then, the other end of the polarity, if there's no structure, people fall apart, kind of can't relate to everyday people and stuff. I know the Zen tradition, from what I understand, is that a lot of the retreats in practice is very well structured. Mm-hmm. So you have this container where they can do these kind of inward practices, but they don't have to worry about arranging the external world, because it's this time you meditate this, or if you go on retreat, you meditate at this time, you eat at this time, you do your yogi chore at this time. So a lot of the time we spent arranging our external conditions, it's already set in place, so we don't have to waste a lot of time, energy, and effort and distraction on that. So, but I mean, that's not really practical in everyday life, right? So that's why we come up with some routines and things that will help with this. Is again the point of not turning it into a ritual, because some people, when they do, then they can't follow through in that ritual. Then all hell breaks loose, and then
they become compulsive.
I know.
I've
done the same thing too, and then it throws off my whole day, and then I feel off and things like this. So it's like, where's the balance?
Yes,
point?
but what that leads to, sorry,
Sure.
When we work with our body and begin to do the self-nurture, that's where the psychological processes also kick in, because then you begin to observe, okay, why am I so compulsive about this ritual? Why is it so important for me to do it this way? Why, all of the whys, and then begin to investigate the emotional field that is behind the biofield. And to be honest, I had already begun the emotional work before I began the physical work, interestingly enough. So, but I learned in early childhood that I kind of had to work with my body, but it kept slipping away because the psychological processes were more in front. So for me, I went through the psychological process, including becoming a professional psychotherapist and do all the things I needed to do there. But most of the work I'd done myself already. I just needed the group, again talking about peers, I needed the group to mirror back to me where I was off and where I was spot on. So I needed other people to mirror to me some of my own ideas. So for me, it's always been different, as in, I'm not using other people to tell me what to do. I'm using other people to correct my own what we call ideas and how I perceive reality, my frames of references. So they are teaching, they become my teachers, showing me in all of their different responses to what I'm doing, whether it's good or bad. Yeah.
I think it's a balance of being dogmatic, right? Being really dogmatic and being disciplined, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Which one of the D's do you do?
Lots of Ds.
Somewhere in between, yeah.
There is such a close correlation between emotions and the body, and also mental processes in the body, right? Sure. These certain, and there's a feedback loop sometimes between, or a lot of times, most times I would say, between emotions and thoughts, right? A thought will feed an emotion will feed a thought or a thought pattern, and all the while there tends to be a bodily correlation, right? Angry, there's a lot of heat. You know, if there's anxiety, maybe it'll be holding in the stomach, or some people have frozen shoulders and hip things. All seem to be either frozen into place or noticeable when there's certain emotions and thought processes.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that was definitely a part of my awakening process too, in this whole working with the body and working with the ailments of the body and working with the pains of the body. And I'm also working as a healer, so I began working with the healer modalities. Okay, what is similar to the cup? What is my body actually telling it? What it wants attention, and what is that attention about?
What does it need?
What does it need? Why do I have that physical pain there? And then really begin to listening to my own body, saying, "Okay, let's learn to communicate, buddy."
Yeah, good pun. Yes, and it's balancing again between going too far off into hypochondriac, where it's like every little thing, putting so much attention on every little thing, where the other extreme is being lazy. Oh, it's okay. It's just a minor pain. Doesn't need to be looked at. Who cares? Kind of thing, right?
But you see, when I began that work, I already done all the psychological work. So for me, I didn't fall into these traps.
Exactly.
But
it's
because
an
if you
intuition.
think,
You know exactly how much
the
attention.
psychological maturing. This I want to stress that again,
Sure.
because many people that begin on the spiritual path or whatever, even if it's the Buddhist path or the enlightenment path or whatever path they're on, they have not done the psychological work. They have not scrutinized their own emotions, their childhood issues, their childhood traumas, and they think they are so awakened, but they're really just projecting a lot of defense mechanisms, a lot of safety mechanisms, a lot of things into the to cope into the mix and create systems where they are very enlightened, but you just need to poke them a little bit, and then they become enormously defensive because I want to protect the system, because at the end of the day I don't want to feel my own pain. I don't want to feel my trauma. I don't want to feel this. And all the things we're not working with psychologically will eventually become an ailment of the body. So that's the approach I had when I work with the body, not as in kind of, this is let me just put it this way. I work with the pains of the body because it shows me there's something going on in my emotional field that I'm not aware of. But my body tells me you need to focus on this one. So for me, it's not just the body. It's not because I'm afraid of illness. It's a tool of transformation.
Very cool. And so this brings to mind a point to circle back on is the terminology, because these new terms, they help break people out of these locked in systems and things. They think they know what one thing is by a certain name, then they don't have to investigate it any deeper. But if it's called by another thing, that's at least, it's somewhat similar to that, but it could easily bring in more dynamics, and people have to stop in their tracks and say, oh, wait a second, do you mean this and this and this? They have to draw on their past reference points, and sometimes nothing really sticks. Or if they have to think about it each time, then it's kind of creates this mental crisis until they kind of adopt a new perception about whatever the area of investigation is or whatever. That's how I see how helpful new terminology can be, or at least reinventing terminology. So, but as far as the psychological processes, what do we recommend some tools that people work with just on the psychological level? I know we talked about tarot, but that's maybe a little bit of the deeper psychological. I mean, the obvious thing is, if people haven't done therapy, I know it's kind of a cliche and kind of an insult to some people to say, hey, you should go do therapy, right? This is what we say to people when we don't want to deal with them or, but the brief stint I did, I found very, very helpful. But what I found in general was at a certain point, it was like, I was dragging up material again and again that I have been over, and there was no new ground at a certain point. But up to a certain point, it was so helpful. Yeah. But after a certain point,
I normally tell my students to buy 10 sessions with a psychotherapist. And what's the purpose of it? Because we can always go deeper. So it's not the psychotherapist that is there to help us solve our issues, but in the conversation, opening up within a safe space where you get the tools how to work with your psyche. Yes. That's the quickest way to get the tools. Of course, you can study it. Sure. You can do your education. You can go on YouTube. There are plenty of tools out there that you can get. But the whole idea is how to work with your psyche, similar to how to do the correct type of exercise that's suitable for your body. What type of nutrition do you have to get the right nutrients for your body type? All of these investigations of the tools that we have available. And I would say these tools of the psyche, the tools of the body, the tools of mythology, the tools of discipline, the tools of how to work with energy on a broad scale are 10 times more awakening than any spiritual teaching system you can come up with.
So have a well-equipped toolkit, right?
Yeah.
And what about anything in specific as far as psychotherapy, like what brands, what versions or modalities of it? The main thing is, though, just to talk to another human being. It's different than just studying
Depends
things
on
online.
Your trauma. Depends on your trauma.
And that's another thing. I mean, we're not going to go into huge trauma here, but I would say if you're born into a human form, you're not going to escape without some kind of trauma. I mean, some people have it really extreme, but we all have some degree of trauma.
Again, it's a spectrum of different types of
it.
It's physical, emotional, mental, what type of trauma we're dealing with. But everybody has kind of got childhood wounds, whether they know it or not, or whether they want to recognize it or not. But normally I say, well, again, pick your healer, pick your therapist, pick whatever you're dealing with, the one that people feel that they feel safe with, that they kind of feel this, here it resonates with me. All depending on what type of energy system they have got. If you talk about me, for instance, have I used a healer? Yes, I've gone to 2 healers, but I felt they were actually destroying my energy system more than actually helping me to repair it. But then I used that experience. Okay, why do I feel that they are kind of? And then that led me to take I did my own healer, not did my own healer education, but I went to an academy where I was taught how to heal. And there I also know that's not the right way to do it. So for me, when the teachers I have are either reality itself, or the people show me what I need to get better at because they show me where I got gaps and what I need to be more involved in, or they do something to me that is absolutely detrimental to my own awakening process, but then I know that's not it. And then I ask the question, then what is it? And since I can't find it out there, I need to find it in myself and then develop that tool, that toolkit, that way of doing it, and that helps me, and without getting into the trap, of course, of, oh yeah, I'm doing so fucking good, I'm so woo-hoo, I'm so brilliant, right? Where we have that self-investigation and that scrutinizing, very, very strong scrutinizing discipline, and always turning every stone.
Yes, I think that's really important. Asking yourself why. Why am I feeling this way? Why am I responding that way? The why is very important.
The purpose for doing all this too, why is this important? And this kind of comes full circle to the first one we did too. And it reminded me of this axiom basically, or this thing that pain can be a teacher. So just all these kind of mistakes and mishaps and things that went wrong, there's no really failure as long as we learn from them, right? And not repeat the mistakes.
I think there has to be some sort of intent and alchemy though during that process. There's like a nodal point there energetically where you have to have that will and intent to really understand the lesson truthfully and then make the right choices, whatever those might be, or what you think are the right choices in that moment. So
discernment, and this inquiry process, it's very energizing too. It kind of takes a lot of energy, but it also can provide a lot of energy too, right? Looking into things, asking the questions, asking the hard questions. Sometimes it seems daunting to begin with, but a lot of times I just ask questions, not necessarily wanting an answer or needing an answer, just asking the questions.
Putting out there.
There's a good esoteric saying that is when the student is ready, the teacher shows up. And that's...
The next part of that too. When the student is really ready, the teacher disappears.
Yes, exactly. Because that's kind of where people that are doing this, they're saying, oh, this is about me finding this is synchronicity. I'm drawn to that teacher. I'm drawn to this or that, whatever. So he or she is to be my new guru, right? Mm-hmm. And guru means, that Hindu means teacher, or the new rabbi, or the new whatever.
Sure.
But the point of that saying is actually the true teacher is not an outer teacher. It's the inner teacher. And who is the true teacher? That's actually the soul, or the high order energy system, as I say. So when we say the student is ready, so for the awakening process within the esoteric teaching systems and the old spiritual teaching systems, were to get yourself, we see that with the master, the apprentice, or whatever we're dealing with, it's all about getting the body, the emotional field, the mental field ready to receive the higher order knowledge that comes from within. That's the true teacher. Because when we talk about external teachers and external teaching systems, they are often written down by people, similarly as I have. I'm very focused on not doing that when I do my material. Hence, my work with clients and with people and students, and I try to put in, make it generic so it's not just replication of what I have experienced, but what others can use. But the higher up in awareness you get, the lesser you can rely on anybody else than yourself, but not as a complete jerk or a complete whatever we would call service to self orientations. That's what happened with the magicians of Atlantis. But going that understanding that whatever I'm doing, let us put it this way, within the benevolent teaching systems or benevolent awakening processes, that kind of goes with progressive dynamics. There's always this for the highest good of the many. Whatever we do not do it for ourselves, we do it for the highest good of the many. That means we're an exemplification of a process of enlightenment or a process of progression or a process of expanded awareness that will create an exemplification as the first of many. So that means that can lead to others to do the same thing. So what I'm doing so I kind of begin a path. I begin as a way of existing that others can follow if they choose to do so. But the point is that they will choose to do it in their own means and in their own rights and by their own devices and in their own ways. So they become the first of many for many other people. So everybody begins as the first of many. And as we go through that understanding and we understand the balance point, this is principle 2, where we balance what we experience, what we develop with reality and with others and with self, we also discover that enlightenment journey then makes us humble, because whatever we do, we cannot do it in a vacuum. We are always connected to someone else or reality itself or our own soul for that matter. So we're always in between, and that's technically the esoteric understanding of the cross. You're always nailed to some kind of cross that limits you, that makes you concerned, that makes you humble, that constantly pushes you back. That's what the crises are about. Pushes you back into know thy place, not as a kind of humble, subservient thing, but know your place energetically. And the more you understand that energetic power you actually have when you do awaken and understand the balance of it as the first of many, as an exemplification, always within a context of something where you always have to balance your energies in the right manner, in the right form, and in the right context, and the right, what we call it, unfolding their amount. That was what I wanted to say. You also learn the principle 3, which is the law of participation, where you then understand what you actually can go in and change, to go back to the first podcast, what you can change, which limitations you should break down, which one you should transform, which one you shouldn't transform. That's discernment. And then you begin to have the
reciprocity.
Yes, thank you. That mirrors back to, from reality, from all of these limitations, mirror back to you, where you're actually allowed to go beyond the limitation and expand. And that's where you really begin the awakening. And that's why we get principle 5. That's the true inner teacher. And that's where we have our own knowledge, because we have learned how to work with energy as an exemplification in a context of something where we are humble and understand our place in it, where we understand what to work with, what not to work with, what to break down, what what not to break down, what to transform, what not to transform. And then learn the mirror effect of reality, not because, oh, this is synergy or this is synchronicity or this is coming to me because then I can do this and that, whatever, but actually learn that whatever we are will be mirrored back. So that means we're using it as a tool of self-investigation. We ask, why is this coming our way? What does that show about me? Is it distortion? Is it something I need to clear out? Can I transform this? What's my purpose of being part of that energy that's been shown to me? How can I grow by that? And how can I grow reality by that? And that's the true teacher. Well, because then you know what to do with everything.
Well, beautiful. Yeah, get into the conduct and the discernment that leads to the inner teacher. And this this points back to, again and again, to the first conversation we had where we just kind of didn't go much into detail about the inner teacher, basically because once you get there, it's the individual teacher. So we thought we would talk about some of the external tools and lack thereof leading up to that moment where the internal teacher takes over and all these other trappings aren't needed at all for the most part.
I think the level of responsibility too, right? You alluded to that. There's a level of responsibility when you get to a certain point, and that's also a guidepost as well.
Yeah.
And how this all ties into our relationships with friends and teachers and how we're not separate from anything as well. So, all right. Seems like a good wrapping up point. And with that, thank you, Alex and Randi, for joining.